A millionaire abandons his family to chase a dream of wealth. After losing everything, he returns home to find a family scarred by abandonment. As he struggles to regain what he lost, he uncovers fraud that puts his home at risk. Now he must overcome his mistakes to save his family and his own dignity. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know which city you're watching from. The rising sun painted the sky with shades of orange over the small town of Green Valley, nestled in the heart of rural America. The chirping of birds and the distant murmur of the creek that ran through the Johnson family's land announced the start of another day. In the modest wooden house, John Johnson woke up restless, as he had been for months. His eyes scanned the simple room, pausing for a moment on the sleeping figure of his wife, Mary. John got up quietly, dressed, and stepped out onto the porch. From there, he could see the expanse of land that his family had cultivated for generations. The fields of corn and beans stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to the hard work of his ancestors. Yet, for John, that view no longer brought the pride it once had. Instead, he felt a growing dissatisfaction gnawing at him. "There must be more to life than this," he murmured to himself, running a hand through his prematurely graying hair. At 45, John felt as though time was slipping through his calloused fingers. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled his senses, signaling that Mary had woken up. Moments later, she appeared on the porch, her brown eyes reflecting a mix of love and concern. "Good morning, John," she said softly, handing him a steaming cup. "Did you sleep well?" John nodded distractedly, his thoughts far away. Mary sighed, recognizing the signs of her husband's restlessness. She knew something was changing in him, something that threatened the stability they had built over the years. The silence was broken by the lively arrival of their children, Anna and Peter. Anna at 17 was the spitting image of her mother, with the same determination shining in her eyes. Peter at 12 still carried the innocence of childhood, but was beginning to show signs of the stubbornness characteristic of the Johnsons. "Dad, are you taking me to town today?" Anna asked eagerly. "I need to buy supplies for my school project." John hesitated, looking at the fields that demanded his attention. "Maybe later, sweetheart. I have a lot of work today." The disappointment on Anna's face was evident, but she didn't push. Mary intervened, offering to take her daughter instead. "I'll take you, honey. I'll do some shopping while we're there." As the family prepared for the day, John remained distant, his gaze lost on the horizon. The weight of responsibilities and the monotony of rural life seemed to suffocate him more and more. In town, the streets were coming alive with the buzz of local commerce. John drove the family's old pickup truck, taking Mary and Anna to run their errands. His eyes wandered over the shop windows, the newer cars passing by, the men in suits entering and leaving offices. It was a world that seemed so distant from his reality, and yet so tempting. It was at that moment that John spotted a figure who would change the course of his life. Augustus Miller, a successful businessman from the region, walked confidently down the sidewalk. John knew him by sight and from the stories that circulated around town, a man who had come from nothing and built an empire. On impulse, John parked the truck and got out, ignoring the confused looks from Mary and Anna. He approached Augustus, summoning all the courage he could muster. "Mr. Miller," John called, extending his hand. "John Johnson, I'd like to have a word with you, if possible." Augustus looked at him curiously, shaking his hand. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. How can I help you?" John hesitated for a moment, aware of Mary's gaze on him. I'd like to learn more about business. You've built something incredible here, and I want more out of life." Augustus smiled, a glint of interest in his eyes. "I see, Mr. Johnson. How about we meet for coffee later? I have a proposal that might interest you." John's heart raced. He nodded enthusiastically, agreeing on the time and place for the meeting. When he returned to the truck, he found Mary with a worried expression. "What was that about, John?" she asked, her voice betraying a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Nothing serious, Mary," he replied, trying to sound casual. "Just a business conversation." The rest of the day passed in a blur for John. He could barely focus on the farm chores, his mind filled with possibilities. When it was time for the meeting, he put on his best shirt and drove to the town cafe, ignoring Mary's questioning look. Augustus was already waiting, a confident smile on his face. "Ah, Mr. Johnson, glad you could make it. I have something to show you." John sat down eager as Augustus unfolded a map on the table. "You see, we're planning a major development here in Green Valley, a tourist complex that will transform the region's economy." John's eyes lit up as he saw the plans: luxurious hotels, golf courses, leisure areas. It was an ambitious project that promised to bring wealth and development to the small town. "And where do I fit into this?" John asked, his voice barely hiding his excitement. Augustus leaned forward, his voice lowering to a confidential tone. "Your land, Mr. Johnson. It's perfect for our project. We're willing to make a generous offer." John felt the world spin around him. The offer was tempting, more money than he had ever dreamed of having. But selling the family land, the land his grandfather and father had cultivated with so much love and dedication? I need to think," John stammered, feeling torn between the desire for a better life and the weight of family tradition. Augustus nodded understandingly. "Of course, Mr. Johnson, take your time, but remember, opportunities like this don't come around twice." John left the cafe in a whirlwind of emotions. As he drove back home, his mind was filled with conflicting images: his family's land, Mary's smile, the bright future Augustus had painted. When he got home, he found the family gathered for dinner. Mary looked at him expectantly, but John just shook his head, unable to share what was on his mind. That night, lying next to Mary, John stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The decision he had to make was the hardest of his life. On one side, the security and tradition of generations. On the other, the promise of wealth and a new life. "What's wrong, John?" Mary murmured, sensing her husband's restlessness. John hesitated, the words stuck in his throat. Finally, turning to face her, he said, "Mary, I think it's time we made a change in our lives." Mary's eyes met his in the darkness, a mix of fear and understanding in her gaze. She said nothing, just held John's hand, as if sensing that a storm was about to hit them. And so, on that quiet night in Green Valley, the winds of change began to blow, promising to forever transform the life of the Johnson family. The dawn in Green Valley brought with it an atmosphere heavy with tension. John Johnson woke before sunrise, his heart heavy with the decision he was about to make. Beside him, Mary slept restlessly, as if sensing the approaching storm. John got up silently and walked to the window. Outside, the first light of day painted the sky in soft hues, illuminating the fields his family had cultivated for generations. Every furrow in the earth, every fruit tree, every wooden fence told a story, the story of the Johnsons. "It's now or never," he murmured to himself, gathering courage. When Mary woke up, she found John sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, she knew something had irrevocably changed. "John," she began hesitantly, "what's going on?" He took a deep breath, the words heavy in his mouth. "Mary, remember that conversation I had in town yesterday? With Mr. Miller?" Mary nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. He made me an offer. He wants to buy our land for a big project, a tourist complex that will change the face of Green Valley." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly. "And what did you tell him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John hesitated, avoiding his wife's gaze. I think we should accept. Mary, it's the chance we've always waited for. We can give Anna and Peter a better life, have the comfort we've always dreamed of." John's words fell like stones on Mary's heart. She looked out the window, at the land that had been their home for so many years. Every inch of that place held precious memories. Their first kiss under the old oak tree, Anna's birth in the small wooden house, Peter's laughter as he played by the creek. "John," she finally said, her voice trembling, "are you sure about this? This land is all we have, all we know." He stood up, walking over to her and taking her hands. "I know, Mary, but think about the future. We can give the kids a better education, have a house in town, live without financial worries. Isn't that what we've always wanted?" Mary felt tears forming in her eyes. Part of her wanted to scream, to beg John to reconsider. But another, a part she barely recognized, felt a spark of hope. A different life away from the hardships of the farm. "And the kids?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. "How are we going to tell them?" As if summoned by her words, Anna and Peter entered the kitchen, still sleepy. The smiles on their faces faded as they sensed the tension in the air. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" Anna asked, her eyes darting between her parents. "John and—" Mary exchanged a glance. It was now or never. "Kids, sit down," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have something important to talk about." In the minutes that followed, John explained Augustus Miller's offer, painting a picture of opportunities and a better life in town. Anna and Peter listened in silence, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. "But Dad," Anna interrupted, her voice trembling, "what about school? My friends? Our home?" John felt his heart tighten. "Sweetheart, you'll have a better school in town. You'll make new friends. We'll have a new house, bigger and more comfortable." Peter, who had remained quiet until then, burst into tears. "I don't want to go. I don't want to leave Grandpa and Grandma." Mary hugged her son, silent tears streaming down her face. "Shh, my love. We'll visit them as often as we can." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Anna locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to her parents. Peter clung to Mary as if afraid she might disappear too. John, feeling the weight of his decision, went for a walk around the property. Each step brought back a memory. There, where he had learned to ride with his father. Over there, where he had proposed to Mary. Further on, where he had played with his children when they were little. In the distance, he saw his father, old Frank Johnson, working on the fence. For a moment, John hesitated. How could he explain to his father that he was about to sell the land he had spent his entire life cultivating? With heavy steps, John approached. "Dad!" he called, his voice faltering. Frank turned, a smile forming on his wrinkled face. "Son, good to see you. Come help me with this fence." John picked up the tools, working side by side with his father in silence for a few minutes. The smell of the earth, the song of the birds, the gentle breeze. Everything seemed more intense, as if nature wanted to etch every detail into his memory. "Dad," John began again, gathering courage, "I need to tell you something." Frank stopped, looking at his son with curiosity. John then told him about Augustus's offer, about his plans to sell the land and move to town. With each word, he saw the light in his father's eyes dim a little more. When he finished, a heavy silence fell between them. Frank looked at the horizon, at the land he knew like the back of his hand. "Son," he finally said, his voice heavy with emotion, "this land isn't just land. It's our history, our sweat, our future. But if you think it's best for your family, who am I to stop you?" John felt the tears he had been holding back finally escape. He hugged his father tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of earth and sweat. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. Back at the house, John found Mary on the porch, her gaze lost in the familiar landscape. He sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "And now?" Mary asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. John took a deep breath. "Now, we start a new life. Together." That night, as the Johnson family prepared for bed, an atmosphere of farewell hung over the house. Anna, still hurt, looked at the stars through her bedroom window, imagining what her life in town would be like. Peter hugged his dog, Max, promising he would never leave him behind. John and Mary, lying in their bed, exchanged a look filled with emotions. Fear, hope, sadness, anticipation, all mixed together in a whirlwind of feelings. "It's going to work out, isn't it?" Mary whispered, seeking reassurance. John held her tightly, trying to convey a confidence he didn't fully feel. "It will, my love. Everything will work out." As sleep finally claimed them, the wind whispered through the trees outside, as if the land itself were bidding farewell to the Johnson family. The full moon bathed the fields in a silvery light, a silent witness to an era coming to an end and another about to begin. In town, Augustus Miller smiled contentedly in his luxurious office. His plan was in motion. Little did the Johnson family know that this decision would be just the beginning of a journey filled with challenges, revelations, and perhaps redemption. The day of the move arrived with a mix of excitement and melancholy hanging over the Johnson family. The sky was overcast, as if reflecting the mood of the residents of the small farm. John woke before sunrise, his heart heavy with the magnitude of what was about to happen. Beside him, Mary slept restlessly. He watched her for a moment, noticing the lines of worry that had deepened on her face in recent weeks. Quietly, John got up and walked to the window. Outside, the property that had been his home for his entire life seemed strangely quiet, as if it too were saying goodbye. Every tree, every fence, every furrow in the earth told a story, stories that would now be left behind. A soft noise pulled him from his thoughts. Turning, he saw Mary awake, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and determination. "It's time," she said softly. John nodded, unable to find the right words for the moment. In the rooms next door, Anna and Peter were also waking up for their last day in their childhood home. Anna, at 17, faced the move with a mix of resentment and curiosity about what the town could offer. Peter, at 12, still struggled to understand why they had to leave the only home he had ever known. Breakfast was a silent meal, punctuated only by the sound of utensils and the occasional bark of Max, the family's loyal dog, who seemed to sense the tension in the air. "Remember, kids," John finally broke the silence, "this is a new beginning for all of us. We'll have opportunities we've never had before." Anna snorted softly, rolling her eyes, while Peter just played with the food on his plate. Mary gently touched her husband's hand. "It's going to be okay," she said, more to herself than to the others. As the morning progressed, the activity on the property increased. Neighbors and friends showed up to help with the final preparations and to say goodbye. Old Frank, John's father, supervised everything with a distant look, his face a mask of contained emotions. "Son," Frank called, pulling John aside. "Are you sure about this? There's still time to back out." John felt a lump in his throat. "Dad, I need to try. For me, for Mary, for the kids. I promise I won't let you down." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes moist. "Always remember where you came from, my son. This land, this place, is part of who you are." A tight hug sealed the conversation, words that didn't need to be said floating between father and son. Meanwhile, Mary was saying goodbye to her mother, Mrs. Collins, in the kitchen. The two women hugged, silent tears streaming down their faces. "Take care of them, my daughter," Mrs. Collins whispered, "and don't forget to take care of yourself too." Mary nodded, unable to speak. That kitchen, where she had learned to cook, where she had shared secrets and laughter with her mother, now seemed strangely small and distant. Outside, Anna was saying goodbye to her childhood friends. Promises to stay in touch and frequent. Visits were exchanged, but they all knew things would never be the same. Peter, on the other hand, clung to Max, whispering promises into the dog's ear. "I'll come back to visit you every weekend, I promise," the boy said, his little heart torn between loyalty to his family and love for his canine companion. Finally, it was time to leave. The moving truck was already loaded, and the family's old pickup was ready for the trip. John took one last look at the house, at the fields, at everything he was leaving behind. "Let's go," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. The family settled into the pickup, a heavy silence enveloping them. When John started the engine, it roared like a lament. Slowly, they began to pull away, the dust from the dirt road rising behind them like a curtain, separating them from their past. In the rearview mirror, John saw his father, his mother, and the neighbors waving. Max ran after the truck for a stretch, barking desperately until the distance overcame him. Mary held John's hand, offering silent comfort. Anna stared out the window, her eyes dry but her heart heavy. Peter sobbed quietly in the back seat, clutching his favorite pillow. As they drove away from Green Valley, the landscape began to change. The green fields gave way to busier roads, and soon the first signs of the town began to appear. Tall buildings, paved streets, a rhythm of life completely different from what they were used to. When they finally arrived at their new home, a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, the reality of the change hit them with full force. The contrast between the spaciousness of their old home and the confined space of the apartment was stark. "Well," John said, forcing a smile, "here we are, our new beginning." Mary smiled back, trying to convey optimism. "Let's make this place our home," she said, hugging the kids. As they unloaded the moving truck, each familiar object seemed out of place in this new environment. The old grandfather clock, Mrs. Collins's cast-iron pots, the children's childhood toys. Everything seemed to tell a story of a past that now felt too distant. That night, after an exhausting day of unpacking, the family gathered in the small living room. The sound of traffic outside was a strange symphony to their ears, accustomed to the silence of the countryside. "And now?" Anna asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. John took a deep breath. "Now, we start our new life. Tomorrow I'll meet with Mr. Miller to finalize the details of the deal. You'll get to know your new schools, and soon we'll all be settled." Mary nodded, supporting her husband. "Ed's going to be different, but we'll be together, that's what matters." Peter, who had remained quiet most of the day, finally spoke. "Can we go visit Grandpa and Grandma this weekend?" John smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Of course, champ, whenever we can." That night, lying in their new beds, each member of the Johnson family faced their own fears and expectations. John, looking at the unfamiliar ceiling, silently prayed he had made the right choice. Mary, beside him, dreamed of a better future for her children. Anna planned how she would adapt to her new school, determined not to let this change derail her goals. And Peter, hugging his teddy bear, fell asleep imagining the adventures Max was having without him. Outside, the town continued its frenetic pace, indifferent to the new residents and their hopes. But for the Johnson family, this was just the first night of a new journey, full of promises, challenges, and perhaps the chance to rediscover the true meaning of home and family. Augustus Miller's office was a monument to urban opulence. Mahogany furniture, contemporary art on the walls, and a panoramic view of the city created an atmosphere of power and success. John Johnson, sitting in a leather chair in front of Augustus's imposing desk, felt out of place in his newly bought suit, which didn't quite fit his farm-worked body. "So, John," Augustus smiled, extending a folder full of documents, "are you ready to become a businessman?" John hesitated, for a moment his calloused hands trembling slightly as they touched the papers. "Yes, Mr. Miller, I'm ready." As John read and signed the documents that would seal the sale of his land and his entry as a minority partner in the venture, his mind wandered. He remembered the look on his father's face when they said goodbye, the apprehension in Mary's eyes, Peter's silent tears. But then he looked out the office window at the vibrant city below and felt a wave of determination. It's for them, he thought, for a better future. Augustus watched John with a calculating smile. "Congratulations, my dear. You've just taken the first step toward a new life. Let's celebrate." The following weeks passed in a whirlwind for the Johnson family. John threw himself into the new venture, spending long hours at the office, learning about business, marketing, and finance. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities, and John pushed himself to keep up with the fast-paced corporate world. Mary, on the other hand, faced her own battles. Adapting to life in town was harder than she had imagined. The apartment, though comfortable, felt suffocating after years of living in the countryside. Household chores, once interspersed with farm work and neighborly interactions, now felt monotonous and lonely. One particularly difficult afternoon, Mary decided to look for a job. "I need to keep busy," she thought, flipping through the local newspaper. Her eyes lit up when she saw an ad, "Experienced laundress needed." It was work she knew well, something that connected her to her roots. Anna and Peter also struggled to adapt. At her new school, Anna faced the challenge of making friends and keeping her grades up. Her rural accent and unfamiliarity with urban slang and customs made her the target of some jokes, but her determination kept her from giving up. Peter, the youngest, seemed the most affected by the change. His grades dropped and he spent hours alone in his room, drawing Max and the landscapes of Green Valley. Homesickness was a constant presence in his sad eyes. As the months passed, the Johnson family's life began to visibly change. The initial success of John's venture brought financial rewards. New clothes, modern electronics, and dinners at expensive restaurants became part of their routine. One Saturday night, the family gathered for dinner at one of the town's most elegant restaurants. John, wearing an expensive suit, smiled proudly. "Look at us," he said, raising a glass of wine. "Who would have thought we'd be here just a few months ago? This is what hard work and ambition can achieve." Mary smiled, timidly, adjusting her new dress that still didn't make her feel comfortable. Anna, though impressed by the luxury, noticed her mother's discomfort and Peter's absence, who had chosen to stay home. "John," Mary said softly, "maybe we should consider visiting Green Valley next weekend. The kids miss home and—" "John," interrupted her, a slight tone of irritation in his voice. "Mary, darling, we don't have time for that now. The business is taking off, and I need to stay focused. Besides, this is our home now. The kids will adapt." The silence that followed was broken only by the clinking of utensils and the murmur of conversations around them. Anna looked at her mother, noticing a shadow of sadness in her eyes. Back at the apartment, John received a call from Augustus. "Great news, partner. The project has been approved by the city council. We'll start construction soon." John's excitement was palpable. He stayed up all night, reviewing blueprints and budgets, imagining the success that was to come. The next morning, the local newspaper's headline read, "Mega tourist development promises to transform the region's economy." A photo of John, next to Augustus, both smiling confidently, took center stage. While John savored his moment of glory, Mary faced her first day as a laundress. The smell of soap and the feel of water on her hands brought back memories of a life that seemed increasingly distant. Anna, at school, overheard the whispers of her classmates about the news. "That's her dad," they said, pointing to the photo. In the paper. For a moment she felt a mix of pride and strangeness. This man in a suit, smiling next to businessmen, seemed so different from the father she had known all her life. Peter, in his room, cut out the photo from the newspaper and pasted it into his sketchbook. With a pencil, he began to sketch around the image of his father, green fields, the old barn, Max running free. It was his silent way of reconciling the past with the present. That night, as the family gathered for dinner, the atmosphere was one of expectation. John spoke animatedly about future plans, about how their lives would change even more. "Soon we'll be able to move to a bigger house," he said, his eyes shining. "Maybe even a mansion." Mary nodded, supporting her husband. "It's going to be different, but we'll be together. That's what matters." Peter, who had remained quiet most of the day, finally spoke. "Can we go visit Grandpa and Grandma this weekend?" John smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Of course, champ, whenever we can." That night, lying in their new beds, each member of the Johnson family faced their own fears and expectations. John, looking at the unfamiliar ceiling, silently prayed he had made the right choice. Mary, beside him, dreamed of a better future for her children. Anna planned how she would adapt to her new school, determined not to let this change derail her goals. And Peter, hugging his teddy bear, fell asleep, imagining the adventures Max was having without him. Outside, the town continued its frenetic pace, indifferent to the new residents and their hopes. But for the Johnson family, this was just the first night of a new journey, full of promises, challenges, and perhaps the chance to rediscover the true meaning of home and family. The cracks in the facade of John's dream were beginning to show, and the next decisions they made would determine not only their financial future, but the fate of their family and the essence of who they truly were. The dawn brought with it a dense fog that enveloped the town, as if nature wanted to hide the transformations happening at a rapid pace. In Augustus Miller's office, the atmosphere was one of expectation and tension. John Johnson, sitting before a table full of blueprints and documents, felt the weight of the decisions he was about to make. "John, my dear," Augustus began, his tone a mix of enthusiasm and urgency, "the time has come for us to take the next big step. The foreign investors are eager to expand the project. We need to act fast." John nodded, his eyes scanning the maps. That showed not just the original tourist complex, but a series of developments stretching across the region. It was grand, ambitious, and, he couldn't deny, frightening. Augustus, John began hesitantly. This seems bigger than we initially planned. What about the promises we made to the local community? The preservation areas? Augustus laughed, dismissing John's concerns with a wave of his hand. Promises can be reinterpreted, my friend. Think of the progress we're bringing. Jobs, development, modernity. A few trees and creeks are a small price to pay. Augustus's words echoed in John's mind, mingling with the voices of his family, the memories of his old life. For a moment he found himself back in the fields of Green Valley, smelling the damp earth, hearing the birds sing at dawn. We need your decision, John. Augustus's voice brought him back to reality. Are you with us in this new phase? While John faced his dilemma in the office, Mary struggled with her own challenges. The work as a laundress, which had initially brought comfort, now revealed its harsher side. Her hands, once calloused from farm work, were now red and sore from the chemicals. That morning, while delivering a basket of clean laundry to a wealthy client's house, Mary couldn't help but notice the contrast between that luxurious mansion and the modest apartment where her family now lived. "Mary, dear," the client said, her tone condescending, "my husband's shirts aren't well pressed. You need to try harder if you want to keep this job." Mary felt her face burn with shame and indignation. She murmured an apology and promised to do better next time, but inside a silent rebellion began to grow. At school, Anna faced her own demons. The group of popular girls, led by Vanessa, the daughter of a local businessman, didn't miss an opportunity to mock her origins. "Hey, country girl," Vanessa called during recess, "I heard your dad's getting important. Maybe now you can buy decent clothes." Anna felt the tears forming, but she swallowed them. With a mix of anger and determination, she turned to Vanessa. "At least I know the value of honest work and true friendship, things you clearly don't understand." Anna's words surprised not just Vanessa, but herself. It was as if an inner strength, dormant since they left Green Valley, had finally awakened. Peter, the youngest of the Johnsons, spent his days at school daydreaming. His drawings, once filled with green fields and farm animals, now showed dark scenes of tall buildings and congested streets. His teacher, concerned, called Mary for a meeting. "Mrs. Johnson," she began gently, "Peter seems to be having trouble adjusting. He barely interacts with the other students and his grades are dropping." Mary felt her heart tighten. We've been going through a lot of changes," she tried to explain. "I'll talk to him, try to help him." That night, when John finally came home, he found an atmosphere heavy with tension. Mary was in the kitchen preparing dinner with abrupt movements that betrayed her frustration. Anna was locked in her room, loud music escaping through the closed door. Peter, sitting on the couch, was furiously drawing in his sketchbook. "Good evening, family," John tried, his voice betraying the fatigue and uncertainty he felt. Mary looked at him, her eyes a mix of love and disappointment. "John, we need to talk seriously." Sitting at the dinner table, the silence was broken only by the sound of utensils. John looked at his family, really seeing them for the first time in weeks. The fatigue in Mary's eyes, Anna's barely contained rebellion, Peter's silent sadness. John began, his voice faltering. "I know things have been tough, but we're making progress. The project is growing. Soon we'll have an even better life." Anna let out a bitter laugh. "Better for who, Dad? For you and your new rich friends." "Anna!" Mary scolded, but her voice lacked conviction. John felt as if he had been punched in the gut. "Sweetheart, everything I'm doing is for you, to give you opportunities I never had." "But at what cost, John?" Mary intervened, her voice soft but firm. "We're losing something important here. The kids are unhappy, I feel. Empty. And you, John? Are you really happy?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. John opened his mouth to respond, to defend his choices, but the words didn't come. Instead, images flashed through his mind. The fields of Green Valley, his father's smile, his children's laughter as they ran free, the love in Mary's eyes when they were young and full of simple dreams. Peter, who had remained silent, finally spoke, his voice small but full of emotion. "Dad, I want to go home, our real home." Peter's sincere plea was the last straw. John felt something inside him break. Tears, long held back, began to stream down his face. I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted, his voice choked. "I wanted so much to give you a better life, but it seems like I'm just messing everything up." Mary stood up and hugged her husband, Anna and Peter joining them. For a moment, there in the kitchen of the small apartment, they were once again the united family they had been in Green Valley. "It's not too late, John," Mary whispered. "We can fix this together." That night, as the town continued its frenetic pace outside, the Johnson family rediscovered something they had lost in the whirlwind of the past weeks: the value of family unity, the true meaning of home. John lay down, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The opportunities Augustus had offered earlier that day still echoed in his mind, but now they were accompanied by the voices of his family, the weight of his roots. The next day would bring difficult decisions, choices that would shape not only his financial future, but the destiny of his family and the essence of who they truly were. As sleep finally claimed him, John Johnson knew he was at a crossroads. The path he chose would determine not only his fate, but that of all those he loved. The moon, visible through the apartment window, cast its silvery light over the sleeping town, like a silent reminder that sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we think, rooted in the simple truths we carry in our hearts. The morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost offensive after the night of intense reflections and emotions for the Johnson family. John woke up before the alarm, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Beside him, Mary slept restlessly, the lines of worry still visible on her face even in rest. Careful not to wake her, John got up and walked to the window. The town was already pulsating outside, indifferent to the dramas unfolding within each home. For a moment, John allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if they were still in Green Valley. The song of birds replacing the symphony of car horns, the smell of damp earth instead of pollution. "John?" Mary's sleepy voice brought him back to the present. "Is everything okay?" He turned, meeting his wife's worried eyes. "I don't." "No, Mary. Honestly, I don't know anything anymore." As the couple prepared for another day, the tension was palpable. Anna and Peter emerged from their rooms with expressions that mixed hope and apprehension, as if fearing that the vulnerability shown the previous night was just a fleeting dream. Breakfast was a silent meal, each family member lost in their own thoughts. John, looking at the faces he loved so much, felt the weight of his decisions as never before. He began hesitantly. "I'm going to talk to Augustus today, about our concerns, about the direction things are taking." Mary reached for her husband's hand, squeezing it gently. "We're with you, John, whatever the decision." At the office, the atmosphere was one of agitation. Employees rushed from one side to the other. Phones rang incessantly. John walked to Augustus's office, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Ah, John," Augustus greeted him with a wide smile. "I was eager to see you. I have exciting news." Before John could speak, Augustus began to unroll a series of blueprints and documents on the table. "The foreign investors were impressed with our plans. They want to double the investment. Imagine, John, not just a tourist complex, but a real revolution in the region." John looked at the papers, seeing not just numbers and projects, but the future of his homeland being redesigned. "Augustus," he began, his voice trembling, "this seems too grand. What about the promises we made? The preservation areas? The jobs for the local community?" Augustus made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Details, my dear, we can adjust that later. The important thing is to seize this unique opportunity." Meanwhile, in town, Mary faced her own challenges. Determined not to be intimidated again, she arrived at her employer's house with a new resolve. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, keeping her voice firm, "I came to pick up the laundry, but first I'd like to talk about the working conditions." The employer looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting such assertiveness from her laundress. "What do you mean, Mary?" "The products I use are hurting my hands," Mary explained, showing the red marks. "Also, the workload has increased, but the pay remains the same." For a moment, Mrs. Rodriguez seemed speechless. Then, to Mary's surprise, a small smile formed on her lips. "You know, Mary, I admire your courage. Few would have the audacity to confront me like this. Let's talk about this, shall we?" At school, Anna faced Vanessa and her group with newfound confidence. "You know, Vanessa," she said, looking the girl in the eye, "I've spent too much time worrying about what you think, but the truth is your opinion doesn't matter. I'm proud of who I am and where I come from." Anna's words caught Vanessa by surprise. For a moment, the rich girl's mask of arrogance fell, revealing unexpected vulnerability. I didn't know it bothered you so much," she murmured, almost like an apology. Peter, inspired by his sister's courage, decided to open up to his teacher. "Mrs. Olson," he said after class, "I really miss home. Our farm, the animals, Grandpa and Grandma." The teacher looked at him with compassion. "Peter, thank you for sharing that with me. How about we use this longing creatively? You could do a project about your hometown, show your classmates where you come from." The boy's eyes lit up with the idea, a spark of enthusiasm that hadn't been seen in a long time. Back at the office, John and Augustus continued their heated discussion. "Augustus," John insisted, "I can't just ignore the impact this will have on the community. This land, these people, they're part of who I am." Augustus looked at him with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "John, you need to decide. Do you want to be a businessman or a sentimentalist stuck in the past? You can't have both." Augustus's words hit John like a slap. For a moment, he saw clearly the abyss that was opening between the man he was and the man he was becoming. "Maybe," John said slowly, "maybe I don't want to be either. Maybe I just want to be myself." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to underline the importance of the moment, John's phone rang. It was Mary. "John," her voice sounded urgent, "something happened. Your father, he had an accident on the farm. It's not serious, but—" The world seemed to freeze around John. All concerns about business, investments, and status suddenly seemed insignificant. "I'm coming home," he said, his voice firm for the first time in weeks. "We're going to Green Valley, now." Augustus looked at him dumbfounded. "John, you can't just leave. We have meetings, important decisions." But John was already at the door. "Some things are more important than business, Augustus. My family is one of them." As he drove home to pick up Mary and the kids, John felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The road to Green Valley stretched ahead, not just as a path back home, but as a return to himself. The Johnson family piled into the old pickup truck with a mix of anxiety and relief. As they left the town behind, each of them felt they were not just traveling back to their roots, but also toward an uncertain yet promising future. As the urban landscape gave way to green fields and dirt roads, John looked at Mary, then at Anna and Peter in the back seat. In each of their eyes he saw a reflection of his own emotion, fear, hope, love, and above all the certainty that together they could face any challenge. The moon, now visible in the twilight sky, seemed to guide them back home. For John, it was as if the celestial body were illuminating not just the path ahead, but also the way back to his true self. The old pickup truck navigated the dirt roads with a familiarity that comforted the Johnson family. Every turn, every tree by the roadside brought back vivid memories of a life left behind. John drove with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time, his eyes alternating between the road and the rearview mirror, where Mary, Anna, and Peter watched the landscape with a mix of emotions. "How's Grandpa?" Peter asked, breaking the silence inside the truck. Mary stroked her son's hair. "Your father said it's nothing serious. Just a small accident on the property." Anna, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke. "I can't wait to see the farm again," her voice revealing a nostalgia that surprised even herself. John smiled through the rearview mirror, feeling a weight begin to dissolve. The town, with its skyscrapers and empty promises, seemed increasingly distant with each mile traveled. As they approached the property, The first face they saw was Mrs. Collins, Mary's mother, waiting for them on the porch. Her expression mixed worry and relief. "My God, you're here!" she exclaimed, opening her arms for a collective hug. Old Frank Johnson was sitting in his rocking chair, a simple bandage on his arm. His eyes, however, shone with the same strength as always. "Well, well, I thought you'd forgotten about me," he said, trying to sound stern, but unable to hide his emotion. John approached his father, a lump in his throat. "How are you, Dad?" Frank looked at him for a long moment. "Better than you, it seems," he replied, his voice heavy with meaning. The property looked exactly the same and completely different at the same time. The fences needed repairs, some fruit trees seemed less cared for, but the essence remained intact. The smell of damp earth, the song of the birds, the distant mooing of the cattle, everything brought back memories the family had tried to forget. Mary immediately started preparing dinner, her movements as natural as if they had never left. Peter ran around the property, rediscovering every corner, every tree. Anna helped her grandfather change his bandage, listening to stories about the farm. "So," Frank said, looking directly at John, "are you going to tell me what brought you back?" John hesitated. He knew his father could see right through him. "We missed it," he replied simply. Frank let out a short laugh. Missed it or had trouble? That night after dinner, the family gathered on the porch. The starry sky of Green Valley seemed much broader and truer than the town's sky. John told them about Augustus's project, about the expansion proposals, waiting for his father's reaction. "Son," Frank said after a long silence, "land isn't just business. It's history, it's life. Every inch of this land has a story of ours, of our ancestors." Anna, who had been quiet until then, intervened. "Dad, what are we going to do now?" John looked at his family. Mary held his hand, her eyes conveying silent support. Peter slept in his grandmother's lap. Anna watched him with a mix of expectation and hope. "We'll talk to the community," John finally replied. "See what everyone thinks about the project. We can't decide alone." The next morning, news of John's return spread quickly through Green Valley. Neighbors, old friends began to appear on the property. Each brought a story, a piece of information about what had happened in the region since he left. Augustus, on the other hand, didn't take long to find out about John's return. Calls started coming in, first polite, then more insistent. "You can't just abandon the project," Augustus shouted over the phone. John, sitting on the porch with his father, just smiled. "Actually, Augustus, I think I can." The Johnson family had returned, and with them the hope of rewriting their own story. The news of John Johnson's return spread through Green Valley like wildfire. Within days, the entire community was talking about the prodigal son's comeback and the rumors about Augustus Miller's project. At the town hall, the atmosphere was one of anticipation. Mayor Gerald Fields, a middle-aged man known for his political savvy, called a community meeting to discuss the development that promised to transform the region. "We need to hear all sides," Gerald declared, his gaze sweeping over the faces of farmers, merchants, and landowners gathered in the parish hall. John sat next to his father, Frank. Mary, Anna, and Peter occupied nearby chairs, watching attentively. The tension in the room was palpable, each person carrying hopes and fears about Green Valley's future. Augustus Miller arrived promptly, his expensive suit contrasting with the simple clothes of the locals. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on John with a mix of challenge and irritation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Augustus began, his voice full of confidence, "the project we represent will bring progress, jobs, and development to our beloved Green Valley. We cannot let fear of the new prevent us from growing." Frank Johnson was the first to stand up. "Progress isn't just about building hotels and golf courses. Progress is about preserving our history, our culture, our land." Murmurs of approval echoed through the hall. John watched the scene, feeling the weight of responsibility. He knew his decision would affect not just his family, but the entire community. Anna, sitting beside her mother, felt a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her still remembered the initial fascination with the project, the promises of a better life. But now, back in Green Valley, she saw clearly what they could lose. Peter held his mother's hand, his big, attentive eyes scanning the faces of the adults. Even without fully understanding, he sensed the importance of the moment. Augustus pressed on. Do you want to keep living like your grandparents? Without opportunities, without prospects? This project can completely change your lives. John finally stood up. The room fell silent. Everyone waited to hear what the prodigal son had to say. Growth can't come at the cost of destruction, John declared, his voice firm. We can't trade our history, our identity, for a few buildings and empty promises. Mary looked at him with pride. This was the John she knew, the one who had gotten lost in the ambitions of the big town. The debate went on for hours. Farmers shared their concerns. Some young people defended the possibility of new jobs. Others feared losing their roots. Augustus, realizing he was losing control of the situation, changed tactics. He approached John, speaking in a low voice. You're throwing away the biggest opportunity of your life, he whispered. Think about your family, your children's future. John replied calmly. I am thinking exactly about that. At the end of the meeting, a vote was proposed. The community would collectively decide the fate of the project. The following days were filled with intense activity. Augustus pressured John, sent documents, made insistent calls. The Johnson family, however, remained united and resolute. One night after dinner, Frank called John for a private conversation. Son, I know it wasn't easy to give up that dream, but sometimes we need to choose between being successful or being true. John hugged his father, tears in his eyes. I learned the hard way that success isn't measured by money or status, but by what really matters. Mary watched them from the porch, holding Peter in her arms. Anna stood beside her, her eyes shining with a new understanding of family and belonging. The moon illuminated the property, a silent witness to a family rediscovering its true value. Green Valley awaited the final decision, hoping that love, community, and tradition would prevail over purely financial interests. The fate of an entire community hung in the balance, and the Johnson family was at the center of this story that promised profound transformations. The day of the vote dawned with a thick fog covering Green Valley, as if nature itself were in suspense. At the town hall, tables were set up, ballot boxes prepared. The community mobilized like never before. John woke before sunrise, watching Mary sleep. His hand found hers in a gesture of unity and trust. In the next room, Anna and Peter slept, unaware of the importance of the day ahead. Frank Johnson was already on the porch when John stepped out. Son, today's the day, the old man said, his voice heavy with meaning. In the kitchen, Mrs. Collins was brewing strong coffee. Eat something, she told John, her tone half order, half affection. Important days require strength. The early hours of the morning were filled with intense activity. Farmers, merchants, young and old, made their way to the town hall. Augustus Miller circulated, trying to make last-minute appeals. You can't let this opportunity pass, he argued with some voters. Think of the progress, the jobs. John watched him from a distance, feeling a calm that surprised him. Mary held his hand. Whatever the decision, she whispered, we'll be together. Anna and Peter were also present. The girl, now more mature, watched the process attentively. Peter, holding his grandfather's hand, sensed the importance of the moment, even without fully understanding it. Mayor Gerald Fields opened the assembly. Today we'll decide the future of Green Valley, he declared. Every vote counts, every opinion matters. The discussions were heated. Representatives from different sectors spoke up. A young farmer defended the project, speaking of opportunities. A retired teacher argued for preserving local identity. Augustus made his final speech, promising investments, modernization, progress. His arguments were convincing, his persuasive power impressive. When John was called to speak, a complete silence fell over the room. I came from a dream of greatness, he began, believing that money and status were what mattered most. But I learned that our true wealth lies in our community, in our history. His speech moved everyone. It wasn't a rehearsed speech, but a testimony of his own journey. The voting began. Ballots were cast slowly. The atmosphere was one of absolute expectation. As the votes were counted, Augustus maintained a confident posture. John, on the other hand, was serene. Mary held his hand, offering silent support. The result was announced in the late afternoon. By a narrow margin, the community decided to reject Augustus Miller's project. The reaction was immediate. Some celebrated, others were frustrated. Augustus, visibly furious, approached John. "How destroyed a unique opportunity," he shouted. John remained calm. "We preserved something far more valuable than money, our identity." As they left the town hall, the Johnson family was met with applause. Neighbors hugged them, children smiled. That night, gathered on the porch of the old house, they celebrated. Frank looked at his son with pride. "You found your way back," he said. The moon illuminated Green Valley, a silent witness to a community that had chosen its own destiny. John looked at Mary, Anna, and Peter. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they were together. And together, they could face any challenge. The days following the vote brought a new dynamic to Green Valley. The victory against Augustus Miller's project had awakened a sense of unity and hope in the community. John, who had once seen the land only as a financial resource, began to rediscover the true value of the family property. Alongside Frank, he started recovering old, sustainable farming techniques, reviving practices that had been forgotten in his quest for quick success. Mary, inspired by the new perspective, developed a project to produce homemade preserves using fruits from their own property. Her initial idea was simple: to create a small alternative source of income for the family. Anna, motivated by the resistance movement, began studying forms of sustainable local development. Her school projects now focused on economic alternatives for rural communities, sparking the interest of teachers and classmates. Peter, the youngest, found a new passion in the land. Under Frank's guidance, he began learning about farming, animal husbandry, and environmental preservation. Augustus Miller, on the other hand, didn't give up easily. His attempts to pressure the Johnson family and the Green Valley community became more subtle, but no less dangerous. One sunny afternoon, a lawyer showed up at the Johnson property, carrying a stack of documents. It was a legal attempt to pressure the family into reconsidering the sale of their land. "Do you have documents proving full ownership of this land?" the lawyer asked, his tone challenging. Frank, with his characteristic wisdom, replied calmly, "Every inch of this land bears the signature of my father and grandfather. We have all the necessary documents." John, who was present, felt a mix of pride and determination. The lesson he had learned was clear. True wealth wasn't in papers or contracts, but in the connection to the land and family. The Green Valley community, inspired by the Johnsons' resistance, began developing collaborative projects. A group of young people led by Anna created a cooperative to value local production, seeking sustainable economic alternatives. Mary expanded her preserves project, securing partnerships with small local businesses. Her artisanal products began gaining recognition, not just for their quality but for the story behind each recipe. Peter, with his childlike curiosity, turned part of the property into a small agricultural experimentation lab. Under Frank's guidance, he learned about environmental preservation and traditional farming techniques. Augustus Miller continued his attempts at pressure. Calls, documents, intermediaries were constantly sent, but the Johnson family remained united and resilient. One day, Augustus himself showed up at the property. His luxurious car contrasted with the simplicity of the rural setting. "There's still time to reconsider," he told John. "We can negotiate." John looked him in the eye. "There's nothing to negotiate. Our land is not for sale." The determination in his voice was unmistakable. Augustus, realizing he had lost the battle, left visibly frustrated. That night, gathered on the porch, the Johnson family celebrated their small but significant victory. Frank told stories of resistance. Mary brewed hot coffee. Anna discussed her projects. Peter drew his dreams. John looked at his family, feeling he had finally found his true place in the world. He wasn't the businessman he had once dreamed of being, but something far more valuable. A farmer, a father, a son, part of a community. The moon of Green Valley illuminated the property, a silent witness to a family that had chosen love, unity and tradition over any promise of fleeting wealth. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Johnsons were together, and together they would face any challenge. 2 years had passed since the decision that changed the fate of the Johnson family and Green Valley. The property, once threatened by speculative projects, was now an example of sustainable development and community cooperation. John had completely transformed. His old dream of quick success had given way to a deeper understanding of wealth and fulfillment. He worked side by side with Frank, learning and relearning the secrets of the land he had once seen only as a financial resource. Mary had expanded her preserves project. What started as a small initiative had grown into a cooperative involving several families in the region. Her products, made with traditional recipes and local ingredients, were gaining recognition beyond Green Valley. Anna, now about to start college, had developed a university extension project focused on sustainable development for rural communities. Her research, inspired by her own family's story, was attracting the attention of professors and researchers. Peter, now a teenager, had become an enthusiast of family farming. His experiments with sustainable farming techniques were beginning to draw the interest of agronomists and research institutions. Augustus Miller, after several failed attempts, had finally given up on his plans for Green Valley. His investments were directed to other projects, far from the community that had proven stronger than his ambitions. On a sunny afternoon, the family received an unexpected visit. Their group of university researchers arrived at the property, interested in the development model the Johnsons had implemented. "It's amazing," said one of the researchers, observing the green fields, "how you managed to turn a potential speculative project into a model of sustainability." John smiled, looking at his family. "It wasn't just us," he replied. "It was the whole community." The cooperative, founded by Mary and Anna, was already generating income for dozens of families. Local products once overlooked were now valued. Young people who had once dreamed of leaving the town were beginning to see possibilities for a future in Green Valley. Frank, though older, remained the family's pillar. His stories and teachings were more valued than ever. Peter listened, attentively, recording every detail of his wisdom. On a full moon night, the family gathered on the porch. It was a time for reflection, for telling stories, for celebrating the journey they had taken. "Remember," John said, "when we thought success was just about money and status?" Mary squeezed his hand. "We learned that true wealth lies in our roots, in family, in community." Anna, with her young researcher's gaze, added, "and in respect for the land and traditions." Peter, looking at the horizon, said, "I want to continue your work. Keep our story moving forward." Frank, watching, his family felt his heart swell with pride. The struggle hadn't been in vain. They had preserved not just a piece of land, but a way of life and identity. The moon of Green Valley, a silent witness to so many stories, illuminated the property. Every corner, every tree, every fence told a story of resistance, love, and hope. John looked at his family. He wasn't the businessman he had once dreamed of being. He was something much better, a farmer, a father, a son, someone who had found his true place in the world. The future was uncertain, as it always had been, but now they were ready to face it, together, rooted in their land, their history, their love.